A spoon scrapes the bottom of a pot while a wall of dust erases the sun outside. On another farm, rows of canned tomatoes decide whether a family will make it through winter. Farther west, dinner is unwrapped inside a federal camp after the road to California. These meals did not begin with the crash of 1929. Many had already been served for nearly a decade, because in farm country the Great Depression arrived before it had a name. In rural America, dinner did not always mean an evening meal. In many farming communities, it was the substantial meal served around midday to sustain labor. The evening meal might be called supper. Here, dinner means the farm's central meal, whatever the hour. And the clock on the farm crisis started before October 1929. After World War I, foreign demand for American agricultural goods fell. USDA historical research traces a sharp price collapse in 1920 and 1921 that kept pressing farmers through the decade. One USDA review counted 163 farm bankruptcies from 1920 through 1929, more than the 37,814 recorded during the 1930s, and sharecroppers were not even included in that bankruptcy count. That changes the picture. When Wall Street crashed, many farm families were already carrying mortgages, low commodity prices, and years of unstable income. In the South, black and white sharecroppers surrendered part of the crop to landowners and could finish the season indebted to plantation stores. On the Great Plains, drought, erosion, and dust storms would turn a market crisis into an environmental one. The plate changed with the region corn and sorghum in the South and mountain country, beans, greens, and preserved meat where families could get them, wheat and garden produce on the plains. No single menu represents every farm, and Farm Security Administration photographs document conditions, not complete recipes. The dinners that follow are evidence-based reconstructions of recurring regional patterns, with a clear line between institutional records and family memory. What emerges is a hidden economy. Women sealing summer inside glass, neighbors sharing work, children reading the size of the harvest in what reached the table. The first meal looks too ordinary to carry that history until you notice what is being poured over it. If you follow stories in which an ordinary food opens a door into forgotten American history, stay with this series. The first dinner begins with two ingredients that still feel familiar, but on a farm in crisis, they worked like a survival ledger. Number 10. Cornbread with sorghum molasses. What sits on a table when a slice of cornbread receives only a dark ribbon of molasses? Across parts of the rural South and Appalachia, corn and sorghum could be grown locally, milled or processed nearby, and turned into an inexpensive meal that could be repeated. This was not a national dish. It was a regional answer, especially recognizable where cash was scarce. Sweet sorghum held a durable place in Southern food traditions. Smithsonian Folklife records describe sorghum molasses as a product made across generations, often through shared work, and used on breads and biscuits. The crucial detail is simple. The sweetener could come from the family's own ground or a neighboring mill, reducing the need to buy refined sugar. The human turn was not in the molasses. It was in the decision to make a small serving feel sufficient. An adult might leave the thickest portion for a child or divide the final slice into equal pieces. No farm ledger recorded that transfer. The echo is still visible. Cornbread and sorghum remain markers of regional identity, and renewed interest in drought-tolerant crops has brought sorghum back into view. Yet a comforting memory can conceal the original constraint. Repetition was not always preference. Often, it was the edge of choice. This dinner still carried sweetness. The next one reveals what happened when a family had to draw flavor and nourishment from the cooking liquid itself, and when inequality helped decide who ate first. Number 9. Beans, greens, and the broth that was never wasted. Can you see a pot of beans thickening beside cooked greens while the dark broth is saved instead of poured away? On Southern and Appalachian tables, beans, corn, and greens formed recurring combinations. When a scrap of salt meat was available, it could season the entire pot. When it was not, the liquid still carried flavor and part of the food's value. For sharecroppers, that simplicity was locked inside a system. A USDA History of Black Farming reports that in 1920 there were 369,942 black tenant farmers and 313 black sharecroppers. Sharecroppers were not counted as farm owners in bankruptcy statistics, but they felt falling cotton prices, debt, and natural disasters directly. The human turn was not in the beans. It was in the person stretching the pot to include one more place setting while controlling neither the land, the crop price, nor the store account. Dinner became a quiet form of protection inside a contract that often shifted risk toward the person with the least power. Beans, greens, and cornbread still belong to the American table. So does a harder continuity. People who produce food do not always have food security, stable housing, or bargaining power over what they earn. The survival of the flavor does not erase the survival of the structure, but stored beans still required some reserve. The next dinner depended on something even less certain: whatever a household garden could produce before weather, debt, or dust arrived first. Number 8. The dinner that grew behind the house. What goes into the pot when the store is distant and the crop has not returned any cash? Potatoes, onions, tomatoes, snap beans, turnips, cabbage, young corn. The combination shifted by season and region. The household garden was not decoration. It could be the part of the farm that fed the family while the cash crop went to the creditor. USDA cooperative extension histories show that during the long farm depression of the 1920s, agents worked not only on production and profitability, but on helping families feed themselves. That detail overturns an easy assumption. Planting hundreds of acres of cotton or wheat did not guarantee variety at dinner. The human turn was not in the garden. It was in reserving land, time, and seed for the household when the entire commercial logic of the farm pushed toward a sale crop. Much of that work fell to women and children and rarely appeared as income, even though it produced the meal. The present-day connection runs through backyard plots, community gardens, and local food programs. They still buffer families in places where fresh food is expensive or distant. In the 1930s, however, a hard freeze or drought could erase that buffer without a nearby supermarket to replace it. The garden solved only the warm season. Once cold locked the soil, a family had to discover whether it had stored enough summer to cross the winter, one jar at a time. Before those jars are opened, notice how often rural survival appears as invisible collective labor. If this kind of historical investigation should continue, subscribe and share the episode with someone who would recognize a pantry shelf before hearing why it mattered. Number 7. Winter stored in glass. How many dinners can fit on a shelf of sealed jars? Tomatoes, snap beans, corn, fruit, pickles, and preserves varied with region, equipment, and harvest. In winter, opening one jar could give color and acidity to a meal built around bread, potatoes, or dried beans. Home canning was more than inherited custom. Photographs and educational records connected to USDA, Cooperative Extension, and the Farm Security Administration show demonstrations of preservation, safety, and pressure cooker use. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, rural educators were promoting more controlled methods because low-acid foods required safe processing, a technical distinction that could separate stored food from danger. The human turn was not in the glass. It was in laboring through summer heat for a meal someone else would open months later. Every sealed lid transferred time, from a mother to her children, from neighbors with equipment to a family without it, from one good week to a failing season. Today, home canning is often a hobby, a culinary inheritance, or a bid for independence. USDA and extension safety guidance still matters. The gesture may look similar. The economic pressure does not. For many 1930s households, losing one batch meant losing several future dinners. Vegetables and glass could not provide everything. To keep fat and meat available for months, families needed a preservation system that worked without a refrigerator, and it began with salt, smoke, and a protected storage space. Number 6. Preserved meat, biscuits, and pan gravy. What remains in a skillet after a small piece of salt meat has seasoned an entire family's meal. The fat and brown traces could take flour and water or milk, becoming gravy for biscuits, cornbread, or potatoes. Meat stopped being the center of the plate. Its flavor was distributed. Before rural refrigeration became common, pork could be salted, cured, and smoked. Historical USDA materials preserved by the Library of Congress presented curing and home canning as ways to save cash and keep food available. The hidden fact in the dinner is that its core technology was not electrical. It was control of salt, temperature, time, and storage. The human turn was not in the piece of meat. It was in the person taking less, so the skillet could feed everyone. Gravy did not create abundance. It redistributed a scarce resource and gave every biscuit a share of the same flavor. The dish survives in breakfasts, diners, and southern kitchens, where biscuits and gravy reads as comfort food. Its rural history reminds us that some American comforts grew from methods of stretching fat and wasting nothing. Refrigeration has made the calculation less visible, not necessarily food insecurity. Preserved meat did not appear on its own. There was a cold day when neighbors gathered, work was divided, and months of meals depended on what the community could store, with little room for failure. Number 5. Hog-killing day supper. Why did so many families wait for cold weather to turn a hog raised over months into food for the season? Hog-killing time was winter work because low temperatures slowed spoilage. In different southern and Appalachian communities, neighbors could divide the labor, prepare fresh cuts for dinner, and reserve the rest for salting, curing, or smoking. There was no single ritual across America. Smithsonian folklife records document communal practices in Louisiana and preservation traditions in Tennessee. Electrification and refrigeration later reduced the need for these gatherings. In 1936, however, USDA estimates that nearly 90% of American farms still lacked electric power. The human turn was not in the animal, it was in the network of people. A household with limited equipment needed labor, knowledge, and sometimes space in another family smokehouse. The fresh dinner marked the work's end, but it also confirmed a mutual obligation. When the neighbor's turn came, the same hands returned. The present has revived ideas such as whole animal use and community purchasing, usually without the same urgency. In the 1930s, wasting a usable part shortened the winter supply. The memory of a feast makes sense only beside the worry of the pantry. Yet no memory of hog-killing day resolves a harsher fact. Thousands of families owned neither the animal, the smokehouse, nor the land they worked. The next table was prepared in front of a stove that exposed that distance. Did anyone in your family preserve memories of home canning, a smokehouse, or a community food working day? In the comments, share the place and the practice, and say whether it comes from family memory or a document. Personal clues do not replace verified history, but they can reveal where the next investigation should begin. Number 4. One pot on a wood-burning stove. How do you make dinner when the same iron box must warm the house, heat water, and cook the meal? One pot of beans, vegetable stew, potatoes, or corn made sense because it concentrated fuel and attention. The cook regulated heat through firewood, placement, and dampers, not a dial. The rural electricity gap was immense. USDA histories estimate that by the middle of the 1930s, roughly 9 out of 10 farms still had no electricity, even as most urban homes already had service. The Rural Electrification Administration was created in 1935. Cooperatives and loans began carrying lines into the countryside, but the change did not happen at once. The human turn was not in the stove. It was in converting absent infrastructure into household routine. Someone gathered wood, tended the fire, carried water, and timed the pot to the field schedule. That daily labor almost never appeared in the price of the food. Modern rural electric cooperatives descend from that transformation. In arguments over broadband, water, and energy, repeat an old question: which services does the market consider too expensive to deliver to scattered communities? A one-pot dinner shows that infrastructure also writes the menu. Electricity could not repair an unjust contract or an impossible debt. The government began entering the kitchen with agents, forms, loans, and advice, and assistance arrived with observation. Number 3. Dinner under supervision. What changes when a federal agent sits at the table and asks how a household spends, plants, and preserves? The Resettlement Administration, created in 1935, and its successor, the Farm Security Administration, created in 1937, offered loans, farm guidance, home management programs, and other support to poor farmers, tenants, and migrant laborers. There was no official FSA dinner. There were efforts to reorganize survival. Home economists and field agents taught garden planning, preservation, pressure cooker use, and household management. FSA photographs recorded demonstrations, kitchens, and participating families. The photography project, begun under the Resettlement Administration and continued by the FSA, produced nearly 80,000 images from 1935 to 1943, according to the National Archives. The human turn was not in the recommendation. It was in the tension of accepting help without surrendering all autonomy. A household could receive seed or credit while its home, habits, and accounts were assessed by an outsider. Assistance and control occupied the same chair. That legacy survives in rural credit, cooperative extension, development programs, and debates over conditions attached to public aid. Technical knowledge could prevent real losses, but poverty was not a recipe error, and a canning lesson could not by itself raise cotton prices or return land to a sharecropper. The contradiction grew harder when the sky itself settled over the table. In the next dinner, the problem was not simply finding food, it was keeping dust out of it. Number 2, dinner inside a dust storm. How do people eat when noon turns dark and dust finds gaps in doors, windows, and wet cloth? In the Dust Bowl, Plains families covered containers, sealed what they could, and still found dirt indoors. Dried beans, bread, potatoes, and canned produce could form a meal, but no archive supports one universal dust storm dinner. What is documented is the environmental and migratory scale. Prolonged drought, exposed soil, and high winds produce devastating storms. Library of Congress materials estimate that about 2.5 million people left the Dust Bowl states during the 1930s. FSA photographs document kitchens, homes, and camps. Oral memories describe dust in food. The image proves the condition. Memory helps reconstruct the sensation. The human turn was not in covering the pot. It was in seating the family while the farm seemed to disappear outside. Serving dinner preserved a sequence: spoon, plate, child, adult, in a world where fence, crop, and horizon no longer felt stable. Today, soil conservation, ground cover, windbreaks, and technical assistance carry the institutional mark of that disaster. Climate migration has returned to the American vocabulary. The Dust Bowl shows how a meal can be lost not only to low income, but to the collision of extreme weather, vulnerable soil, and delayed policy. When dust finally won, some families closed the door for the last time. The strongest dinner on this list did not happen on the farm they tried to save. It happened later, on borrowed ground, when clean water and a place to cook felt extraordinary. If this account is changing how you see the Great Depression, share the episode. The final table is not a legend of California abundance. It is evidence of how much a plain meal changes when someone finally receives a safe place to prepare it. Number 1. The first dinner in a federal camp. What does a family unpack for dinner after crossing the highway in search of work? Perhaps bread, beans, potatoes, or the final jar brought from home. The combination varied, and no archive authorizes a universal menu. The verifiable fact is the setting. Plains families arrived in California and encountered seasonal labor, improvised camps, and, in some places, federal centers, with water, sanitation, and shared facilities. The Resettlement Administration and later the FSA built a network of camps for migrant workers. Library of Congress teaching materials describe 13 self-governing communities, each designed for roughly 300 families. The National Archives records 18 camps at the pre-war peak because totals shift with time and classification. Weed Patch, formerly the Arvin Farm Labor Supply Center, became the best-known example. The human turn was not in the food. It was in cooking without seeking permission from a hostile landowner, drawing water from a ditch, or placing children in a space without sanitation. A modest dinner remained modest, yet for a few hours it no longer served as a public test of exclusion. The present-day impact is direct. Migrant farm workers still sustain a large share of America's food supply and still face problems of income, housing, climate exposure, and food access. The contradiction remains. Producing other people's table does not guarantee a safe table for one's own family. That dinner ended the road, not the crisis. The same government that constructed camps also oversaw agricultural programs that displaced tenants and sharecroppers. And that is where the meal stops being memory and becomes consequence. These dinners do not prove that deprivation created a stronger generation. They prove that households performed extraordinary labor within painfully narrow choices. Cornbread, beans, canned produce, and pan gravy were survival techniques. Romanticizing them without debt, racism, dispossession, and unpaid work turns pressure into decor. Public policy changed what reached the table, but never in only one direction. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration tried to raise prices by reducing production. Library of Congress documents and USDA histories show that benefits could favor landowners and displace tenants, sharecroppers, and laborers. The Resettlement Administration and FSA offered credit, guidance, and camps, while the Soil Conservation Service confronted erosion and the Rural Electrification Administration began changing infrastructure. There was also a struggle over who would be seen. The FSA project's nearly 80,000 photographs documented rural poverty with a force that shaped public opinion. Yet every photograph has a frame, a selection, and an institutional purpose. It records a moment. It does not automatically reveal the menu, thoughts, or entire life of the person pictured. Visual archives must therefore be read beside reports, maps, oral history, and an awareness of what was never recorded. Today, electric cooperatives, soil conservation, cooperative extension, rural credit, and housing programs carry pieces of that response. At the same time, food insecurity and poor housing still affect workers who plant, harvest, and process food. The real consequence is not a preserved recipe. It is the unresolved question of who absorbs the risk in the food system and who receives security. In the next investigation, the table moves. We leave the farm and follow families down the highway to gas stations, improvised camps, and California harvest fields to discover what migrants actually carried to eat, and which meals were created when an entire home had to fit inside a car.